Hello, and welcome back to American Motherhood, where we explore how society and politics shape motherhood in America. My name is Bethany, and today I'm joined by Allison Russo, Ohio House Representative and candidate for Ohio Secretary of State. Allison brings both policy expertise and her perspective as a mom as we talk about what's at stake for families in the 2026 election. We're exploring the barriers mothers face in government, real changes that can make it more accessible, and how working parents can step into these spaces in a meaningful way. We look ahead to the impact she hopes to have as Secretary of State and what it will mean to rebuild trust in our elections. If you've ever wondered how state government connects to your everyday life as a parent or how to make your voice heard, this conversation is for you. And if you're looking to connect with other moms who want to make a difference, join us in Westerville on April 18th for our very first panel event, Bridging the Gap, Finding Where Civic Life Meets Motherhood. You'll find details in the episode description. Make sure you're following us on Instagram and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss what's next. Allison, thank you so much for being here today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
To start, can you please tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so I call myself the accidental politician. I never set out to run and serve an elected office. I spent 20 years as a public health professional working in the space of health policy, specifically around how do we get better outcomes, health outcomes? How do we address cost issues? Focused on our most vulnerable citizens, our elderly population. Also did quite a bit of work with our veteran and military families because my husband was prior active duty and we were a military family as well. But a real turning point for me came in 2016. On election night, I was up with my third child, who happened to be only 6 weeks old at the time, so I had a newborn baby, and watching those election results come back and knowing that it wasn't enough for me only to be an engaged and informed voter, which is really how I described myself up to that point. I needed to do more and to get off the sidelines. I didn't know what that was going to mean, but for me in 2017, it specifically meant doing more advocacy with my member of Congress and with my member of the state legislature, because healthcare was yet again under attack in Congress and at the state level. And by the end of 2017, the state house seat that I am in, the Republican who held the seat decided he was going to run for something else. And a few people said, you should run for office. And I said, you're out of your mind. Absolutely not. I've got 3 kids. I'm extremely busy with my work. But I remembered that promise to myself and my daughter that, I would not be on the sidelines. I would get off the sidelines. And I knew that we needed people in elected office who were there to solve problems and to get things done and to represent the values of our communities. So with knowing nothing about how to run a political campaign, I said, okay, we're going to do this. And those first couple of months were truly a hockey mom friend of mine. My boys play hockey, us knocking on doors and talking to neighbors and voters and having conversations at the door. And by the time we were done, in November of 2018, we had knocked on 45,000 doors, the team of volunteers that we had amassed. And I flipped the state house seat from Republican to Democrat. And so that is how I came into the legislature and was sworn in January of 2019 and haven't stopped since.
And now you're a pro.
Well, still learning, always learning, always learning.
So can you tell us, how has being a mother shaped how you approach policy and leadership?
Well, I think like many women who get a seat at the table, your life experiences inform, the types of policies that you probably put the most energy behind and become your passion. For me as a mom of 3 kids, working mother who's had to deal with childcare issues, who has children who are in public education and in our public schools, as a mom who has seen the struggles that many of our students have in learning loss and addressing behavioral health care needs that have come, especially post-pandemic. Those have been many of the issues that I have focused on and have been my real passions as I have moved forward in the legislature. Within the first year of me being in the legislature, COVID hit. We had the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, my daughter was, I think, 2.5, 3 at that point, and our childcare shut down. And there were a couple of us who were serving in the legislature who had children who were in childcare, and suddenly we didn't have childcare. And so, for us, this became a very real issue that many Ohio working families were dealing with during that period of time. And, watching our childcare centers struggle to get back online, to make the finances work, the need of working parents to have reliable childcare, to be able to stay, to go back to the workforce, but also to stay in the workforce. These were things I knew even before the pandemic, but it became front and center of some of my focus, especially, during that period of time, because our Ohio businesses suddenly started to wake up as well and realize that childcare, it's not just a nice to have or a quote unquote women's issue. This is a real workforce issue that we have to all come together and try to solve.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make childcare more affordable and more options available to working parents?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a reality for many of our listeners, and we appreciate your work on that. Do you think that government is structured in a way that realistically allows mothers to participate, uniquely understanding the barriers that we face and just the struggles, the time struggles, all of the things that we talk about?
Yeah, well, I would say no, it hasn't been. I certainly think having more women with a seat at the table, more women coming from, backgrounds, whether they are mothers or not, they're caregivers or not. I think raising some of these concerns, how do we make meetings, for example, more conducive to working parents? And provide, for example, virtual options for people to participate. Why do we make it so difficult for individuals to come to the State House and provide testimony? You have to come during the middle of the day. The hours are unpredictable. You may have kids that you need to pick up. It's difficult to find parking. All of these barriers that we put in place that make it challenging for anyone to be able to fully participate and engage in the process, or even women running for office. One of the things that we have worked on for a number of general assemblies now is, allowing women, for example, or all candidates, not just women, but all candidates, to be able to use campaign funds to pay for childcare expenses, which is something that you allow at the federal level for federal races. But is not yet approved and available for people running statewide or for local offices here in Ohio. All of these things are important. There are these structural barriers that remain in place that I think, many of us who come with a perspective of being in these caregiving roles, we're trying to remove those barriers slowly but surely so that we have more women, in particular, more mothers who have a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't realize that about the campaign funds. So whether you're drawing from your own experience or other mothers who you have seen run for office, what advice would you share for that, at least that initial hurdle to get more involved?
Yeah. Well, first, I think it is to stop questioning whether or not you are qualified. I think women in particular, we suffer from imposter syndrome. We feel like we need to, check these boxes. I always tell people I was the House Minority Leader, which meant that, I spent a lot of time recruiting people to run for the State House and supporting their campaigns. And, I rarely had to ask a man twice to run for office. Women, at a minimum, we're usually asking 5 different times in different ways. And many of the times it's because women are second guessing, am I qualified to do this work? And so I'd start there and say, yes, you are qualified. But number two, it is, don't be afraid to ask for help. This running with small children in particular, or even school age children, there's a lot to balance. And, even though we're in the year of 2026, often women do still take on the bulk of the caregiving demands of families, not just children, but also, where I'm at the age now where we're also looking at, do we need to start thinking about taking care of our parents as well? And, this is where I think those support networks are important. And what I have found is when you are someone who is going to be a good representative for your community, whether it be on school board, on city council, at the state house, or whatever level of government, there are people who are willing to help you. You have to ask and be willing to ask for the help. And so whether that means, helping prep meals, to make it a little bit easier during the week, extra carpools, helping watch kids for an hour or two while you go to an event. Don't be afraid to ask, because I do think that there is a community that is willing to step up and help in exchange for really good representation and voices in our elected government.
All great reminders. Okay, why should local and state government matter just as much, if not more, than what's happening in DC?
Well, I would argue it does matter much more than what happens in DC. The decisions that are made at your school board, the decisions that are made at city council, the decisions that are made at the state house, they directly impact your lives. I'll take the issue of public schools. And all decisions about public schools, funding, requirements, pay for teachers, extra resources for learning and special services, all of those decisions are primarily made at the state house and by your school board. And so if that is an issue that you're passionate about, the education of your children, you absolutely should be paying attention to what is happening locally and those local races for school board and who sits on those school boards and who represents you at the state house and is advocating for your schools. Very few of those decisions actually come from Washington. And that's just a small example, but a really important one here in the state of Ohio.
Right. Absolutely. What are the stakes of this upcoming election season for families? What are some key policy decisions happening in Ohio right now that we should really be paying close attention to?
Well, I would say, and listen, I recognize that there are many of us in elected office who say every election cycle, this election is the most important. It's so critical. But I say to you with all sincerity, this upcoming election for 2026 is absolutely critical. And I think, for a number of reasons that start in Washington, D.C., but also things that we are seeing now play out at the state house, especially. Number one, I think it is, who are we as a democracy? And those fundamental questions about what it means to have accountability and transparency from every level of government, including the president himself. But then when we think about some of the issues that are most important to Ohio families, affordability, what our schools look like, what access we have to affordable quality healthcare, those things and those decisions are all being made by representation that is up for election or re-election in November. And so I would say, get involved, know your candidates, know what issues are important to you. I'm going to go back to the issue of our public schools and public education. There is a real movement afoot in this state legislature to weaken our public schools and to shift resources away from our public schools where 90% of Ohio's children attend schools. And that will be absolutely detrimental to so many of not only our children who are going to these schools, but also the communities where these schools exist, because often these schools are the center of community life. They are important employers within these communities. I cannot overstate how important it is to hold our elected leaders, Republican and Democrat, accountable for the decisions that they are making about our schools right now. And, that is just a small sliver, but a really important sliver of what's at stake in this upcoming election, especially these statewide elections and elections that impact who represents you in the state house.
Mm-hmm. How can we most effectively hold our elected officials accountable?
Well, first of all, you got to show up and vote. And I know that seems obvious to a lot of people, but we have many Ohioans who sit on the sidelines and don't vote. Either they're not registered to vote. We have close to 2 million eligible adults who would be eligible to vote who are not even registered. We have close to 700,000 registered voters who do not regularly participate in our elections. And so that is a tremendous amount of power that is being left on the table because people just simply aren't participating. So number one, you've got to show up and vote. And I hear from a lot of people, well, why do I need to, I show up and vote, and why does my vote matter? They don't listen to what I say. And I say, that is, first of all, if your vote didn't matter, there would not be so many people who are in power working so hard to make it harder for you to vote and to weaken that power. That's number one. But number two, the most effective form of voter suppression is to make people feel like their vote does not matter. So don't let people in power, politicians in power, take that away from you. And I would say, the second thing is you have to stay engaged. And it does take work and effort to stay engaged, but know who sits on your school board, know who sits on your city council, know who represents you in the state house. Ask to meet with them because many of those elected officials should be and are accessible to the general public. And, attend those meetings, whether it be a school board or a city council member meeting, or, watch on the Ohio channel, which is free. It's online, those hearings for committees about issues that are important to you. And then I would say number three, if there is an area that you are particularly passionate about, whether it be education, whether it be gun safety, any number of issues, connect with an advocacy group that works in this space. And the reason that is important is because a lot of times those advocacy organizations will do some of the hard work for you and send you those alerts about, what damaging bills are coming up and who you need to contact and how you can provide testimony. And it takes some of the work out of the process for you, but those groups are so important. And there are a lot of great organizations out there that are working on a number of issues and focused on local government and state government that can make you a much better and effective advocate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I do want to talk about election integrity. There has been a lot of conversation around voting laws and the election process. What changes have been made recently in Ohio that our voters should be aware of?
Well, over the last several years, especially since I've been in the State House, and I'm in my 8th year in the State House, we have seen this continual chipping away at the ability of voters to conveniently access the ballot box, whether it's, limiting those early vote hours and weekends that you have available to go and participate in early voting, increasing the probability that you might have to cast a provisional ballot because we have limited the form of ID that you have to use to show. And by the way, Ohio has had voter ID for a number of years, decades. The changes have been to limit what ID is acceptable, and it makes it harder for people to get that ID and to keep it current. Or, as recently as December, doing things like eliminating those grace period days that Ohioans have enjoyed for 2 decades at least to get their mail-in ballot back to the Board of Elections so that it's counted, or adding requirements to our boards of elections to do voter file matches to external data sets. And when there's a mismatch because of an error that may be a bureaucratic error that's in the data set, not in your voter file, you getting flagged and then having to go through the effort of correcting that information or casting a provisional ballot, or also potentially having your voter registration canceled and you not even realizing that that has happened. These are the hurdles that have been put in place that at the end of the day most acutely affect working families and people who may not have, the flexibility in their schedules, or may not have the transportation to get to a polling location on one specific day, or may not have the childcare to be able to stand in line for 2 hours to wait to cast their vote, whatever the case may be, or may have a disability that prevents them from easily getting to the poll. Or you may have a student like I do, a college student who's attending school away. And, the only option that they have to exercise their right to vote is through mail-in voting because they're not able to make it home during that early vote period. So whatever the case may be, these are the barriers that have been put in place that impact the ability of people to have their voice heard.
And all at the state level. So just to reiterate,
all decisions, yes, all 90+% of decisions that are made about our election laws and the requirements for elections and how people cast their vote are all made by state legislatures. The U.S. Constitution is very clear. It gives that authority to the states. Congress can certainly pass laws that relate to voting to put in requirements, and they have, and we have some really important voter protections because of that. But most of these decisions, by and large, are made at the state legislative level.
From your perspective, how do we balance election security with making voting accessible for busy families and all of our constituents?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't be. It is absolutely important that we protect the security of our elections, that we make sure that we don't have fraud or the potential for fraud in our elections. But I want to be super clear about this. The processes that we have had in place have worked because we know that election fraud is exceedingly rare. We know that our elections are very secure. And so what we've seen, however, in the last couple of years in particular, mostly because of rhetoric that we've seen coming from the president himself, because he cannot accept that he lost the 2020 elections. And so the only excuse he can put forward is that it must be fraud. And because of that, we have seen Republicans in particular in state houses across the country, including Ohio, overcorrect. So they claim that they are limiting access to the ballot in an effort to reduce or eliminate fraud, which again is exceedingly rare. But the consequence of those overcorrections and those restrictions and those hurdles that have been put in place is that you now have thousands of voters who either can't cast their vote or have a harder time accessing the ballot. And so that to me is just as detrimental as having voter fraud. You can't only address one issue and ignore the consequences when you have thousands of people who cannot have their voices heard or their vote counted. And so there has to be a better balance there. And for me, as Secretary of State, that I know that my job is to be the advocate for voters. To me, it is just as harmful to have a voter who does not have their vote counted, who cannot access their right to vote, as it is to potentially have voter fraud. You have to care about both.
Mm-hmm. We are trying to build a platform that fosters respectful dialogue between mothers and parents across the aisle. So this topic specifically, I hear you say these words, and I imagine you're saying these to your colleagues in the House. But what does disagreement look like in practice at the State House?
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, I am not afraid of disagreement, and I'm not afraid to call out my colleagues across the aisle when I have policy disagreements. And that is fine. That's my job as someone who represents my community and the values of my community. It's my job as someone who sits in the minority party and as someone who has led the minority party in the House, is to call those things out. But, from my perspective, you have to do it in a way that is not attacking people personally, because this work is all about relationships as well. And, you may disagree with someone about this particular policy on this particular day, but you may need them to help you with something else and another policy and another effort on another day. And so, the encouragement that I have always given to members, and especially new members, is it's important to develop these relationships, to get to know people personally, because I firmly believe that regardless of where we all are on the political ideology spectrum, that we have common values and we can find commonality in things that we agree on. We all, I think, want to be able to take care of our families, for our communities to be safe, to have economic security. I think we all fundamentally agree on those things. What we disagree is how to get there. Sometimes we disagree about who deserves that and who should have a fair shot at that and what that looks like. But that only starts with those conversations. And so it's absolutely fine to disagree on policy, on how people vote, and I've never been afraid to go to the mat on those things. And I certainly have that reputation. I'm known to be a little punchy sometimes in some of these debates, but I'm always very careful to make it about the issue and not about the person. And that has been really beneficial to me during my 8 years in terms of being able to also continue to get things done. Because, people understand I'm not attacking them personally, that it is a policy difference.
Mm-hmm. What questions should we be asking our candidates to evaluate them, not just on their policies, but those characteristics that you're touching on now and working well with others, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, for me, where I have found people be the most successful in this work is number one, to not easily be discouraged when you hit a roadblock. Number two, to have the work ethic and personality that you are going to continue to engage in conversation, even with people with whom you disagree. Or, when you are frustrated about an issue, you don't close people down. Because, especially as a Democrat in the Ohio General Assembly, you're going to hit a lot of roadblocks and you're going to face a lot of frustrations. And so the people who are most effective are the people who can work past that, who can really focus on continuing dialogue to build those relationships with even people they don't disagree with. And, I always say, too, to do this work effectively, especially in the minority, you have to be strategic in your thinking and creative. And sometimes that means that you take a loss today in order to get the win tomorrow. or a year from now. And so it's always, not just thinking about what's immediately in front of you, but what are the stakes 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 1 month from, or 1 year from now, and being able to look past the immediate.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see common ground specifically among parents, regardless of political affiliation?
Yeah, where I have found a lot of common ground with my colleagues across the aisle is specifically on issues around children. And more recently, I think on, these issues around childcare and the importance of childcare for all working families. I think we have found a lot of common ground on, how do we address the rising mental health care needs of children, and focus on ensuring that there are resources available to address those needs. I think that we have found common ground on, how do we better prepare children for the workforce of the future and the job needs of the future, and what that might look like. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and sometimes it's in very small ways, and sometimes it's in big ways. But to me, a big part of that, again, comes back to the strength of our public schools. And we've got to have more people in the legislature, both Democrat and Republican, who believe in the value of our public schools and believe very firmly that our public schools have to be the first priority, because, it is really difficult for us to have a future as the state without investment and strength of our public schools.
Mm-hmm. Are there any current proposals that we should be watching out for that continue to either build or take away from our public schools?
Yeah, well, I think there have been a number of issues that have come up. We hear a lot about this property taxes. People rightly are concerned about rising property taxes. The reason that we have rising property taxes in the state of Ohio is because of this continued disinvestment from the state to our public schools and paying the state's fair share of educating our children. And instead, those resources have been sent to give tax breaks to the wealthiest Ohioans, and or to shift more money into the private school voucher program and into these private school entities. And so there are a number of proposals that have been passed, but also that are coming forward, to quote unquote address specifically the property tax concerns that really are not actually providing real targeted relief to Ohio homeowners, but instead are shifting the burden onto our local school districts and onto our local governments. And there really is nowhere left to give. And so what we are seeing at the moment are school districts making very real decisions about budget cuts that come in the form of cutting staff. These are people who are providing either as teachers in the classroom, educators in the classroom, or those support services in the classroom that are so important, or it's cutting programs, or it's increasing fees for things like extracurricular programming in our schools. I have kids who play sports or in a variety of activities, and it's really difficult to participate in those activities if you're paying high fees when people and families are feeling the squeeze, from everywhere at the moment because of rising cost. And so those are things I think to continue to monitor. We're also seeing the shift now, and part of this is because of the makeup of the legislature, in inserting religion into the classroom and into public education. And I feel very firmly that that is not the role of schools. That's the role of families, and that's the role of our faith community outside of schools. But we're seeing, a real push to inject specific forms of religion This isn't even about religious freedom. This is about specific forms of religion into public school teaching and curriculum. So I think those are a number of things to keep an eye out on at the moment. We continue also in terms of, healthcare for moms. Even though we've passed reproductive rights in our state constitution, and we did that in 2023. And Ohio has said very clearly, we want to have reproductive freedom and access to the full scope of reproductive health care. We continue to see this legislature move forward things like creating registries and reaffirming 24-hour waiting periods to get access to abortion services. All of these things have the most detrimental effect on moms, working moms, who, are trying to make decisions about what is best for their families. And they don't need politicians in Columbus, number one, overruling their rights that are now protected in the state constitution, but number two, overruling decisions that they are making between their families and their healthcare providers.
So I would circle back to the importance of evaluating our candidates and getting out to vote, right, to make sure that that our votes will stand, that what we believe in stand as Ohio.
But it's also, we also have to be more vocal. I hear from a lot of people, especially parents, and who say, well, I don't want to get very political. And, my response to this is not about politics. These are decisions that are impacting our lives and your children's lives and your healthcare and your jobs. This is not about politics. This is about speaking out about your values and speaking out about what is important to your family and to you personally. So, also it's about, I think, informing yourself about who these candidates are and what the issues are, but you have to share that information. And, even if you just pick 5 people in your family, your friend group, whatever that may be, to ensure that they are informed, to ensure that they also show up and vote. That is where we start to make large-scale differences in the outcomes of elections and who actually represents us in government at all levels.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, but what are the general responsibilities of the Secretary of State?
Yeah, so very simply, the Secretary of State is the state's chief elections officer. So the job of the Secretary of State is to ensure that all citizens, regardless of how they vote, regardless of what issues they support, that they have access to fair, free, and secure elections. Now, the important thing to know about the Secretary of State is they do have to work in conjunction with the legislature, because it is the legislature that actually sets the rules and the laws that govern our elections. So having a Secretary of State who understands that the job is not to be a partisan playmaker, but is to actually be an advocate for voters, all voters, again, regardless of who they vote for, what they support, to make sure that they have fair and free access to the ballot, that their vote is respected and their voices are heard. That is the job of the Secretary of State.
What impact do you hope to have as Ohio's Secretary of State?
Well, I would say the first impact I hope to have is to restore trust and transparency back to our election process and back to this office. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen, especially for the last 16 years, is a Secretary of State that has, instead of working for the voters, worked to put their thumb on the scale to affect outcomes, access to the ballot in a way that benefits their own party. So that will stop with me. But number two, I think, what I'm most excited to be working on is how do we better use this office and the bully pulpit of this office to address this issue of voter education and voter engagement. Because again, government does not work if it doesn't have accountability and transparency to the people. And the way that you have that is through our elections and through the power of your vote. And that means the people have to know what's on their ballot and how they access their ballot. But number two, they have to participate in the process. And so I'm excited to work to rebuild some of those coalitions, to get, more young people engaged in this process, people who are in communities that where we've seen voter participation and engagement decrease, to ensure that all eligible Ohio voters have convenient access to the ballot, regardless of what their circumstances are, because our democracy only works when we have integrity in our elections and when people are able to exercise the power of their vote.
Mm-hmm. For those of us who are just beginners when it comes to state government, but we want to be more informed and more involved, where should we start? What would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I think for state government specifically, a great place to start is, there are a number of press organizations that are dedicated to covering what is happening at the State House. For example, the State House News Bureau, the Ohio Capitol Journal. Many of our regional newspapers have a State House reporter beat. So I would say start there. Seeking out those news agencies and reporters who are specifically assigned to the State House. Number two, go to you can go, for example, to ohiohouse.gov, which is our Ohio House. The Senate also has a website. You can actually, if there are issues, committees that you want to follow, for example, education, those committees, you can sign up for alerts so that you know when bills are being heard in committee. And then one of the wonderful things about Ohio is we do actually have a lot of transparency in the actual hearings that happen, as well as session. And you can watch all of these things on what's called the Ohio channel. And you can watch them live. You can go back and watch them after they have happened. And that has been, I think, an incredible tool for many folks who want to be more engaged but don't have the time to drive to Columbus Park, go to hearings. You can actually watch it all online or go back and watch it at your convenience. And then again, connect with an advocacy group. One of the groups that I think is fantastic is How Things Work at the State House. Constantly informing and engaging. It's an online community about, how do you give testimony? What are the bills that are coming up that they need folks to show up and testify or submit written testimony? Here are the committee members to reach out to. It's a great resource. You can find them on Facebook. Rachel Coyle, who runs that organization, also does a number of trainings for a variety of groups in communities as well. She's been doing a tremendous job with that. Or connect with a group that is specific to an issue that you care about. People who care about common sense, gun safety, Moms Demand Action, for example, and they've got a number of advocacy alerts. They are wonderful. They show up at the State House. They give testimony. They show up for Advocacy Day. They just had their Advocacy Day last week as well. So there are a number of organizations like that you can connect with that make you a much better advocate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What gives you hope right now when you think about families in the future of Ohio?
Well, I always say, for me, what gives me hope is watching this younger generation, high school, college age. I have the great fortune of working with a number of young people because of my proximity to a large university. And I have a number of young people who work in my office who've interned for me. I have one son who is of college age. But I think watching these young, now new voters, or they're going to be voters, and their engagement with what is happening, their ability to critically think about what is happening, actually gives me a lot of hope about where we are going in the future. We just need to work really hard to keep them here in Ohio. Mm-hmm. That's my biggest concern, is how do we keep them in Ohio, make sure that they come back so that they will have jobs here, they'll build families here, and they'll eventually lead our communities here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, where can we find you this election season if voters want to learn more?
Sure. So the best place is AllisonRusso.com, my website, and also Russo for Ohio on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Threads. I post a lot about not just this race for Secretary of State, but about voting, about what's happening at the State House. That's a great way to connect with me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Allison, for your time today and for sharing all of your advice and insight into what's happening in Ohio.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.